Queenzflip reveals just how he got suspended from the Joe Budden podcast. On a Patreon episode, Flip broke down step by step and detailed how Joe Budden became so infuriated that he kicked him out of the podcast. So let's get right to it. First off, this episode is absent of Joe Budden and it's on his Patreon. And Flip starts off by saying he felt like no one from the podcast defended him when Joe went off on him. Now, if you don't remember, Joe Budden said that Flip angered him so much that he told him he was going to learn him. He was pissed off, and he got up in Queenzflip's face. Very interesting because it looked like Joe Budden finally snapped. And a little bit after that, M4, she doesn't say anything about what Flip is saying, but she says, "That's crazy." Now, what she's saying is that whatever Flip is saying right now about how he got suspended is absolutely crazy. I guess she thinks that's not what happened. We'll break down Melissa Ford's whole role in this a little bit later. The cast then notes how he got paid for the whole time he was suspended. Now, Joe Budden said that he paid Queenzflip despite suspending him. Really weird, and I think it is a breach of his own contract, and it's showing to the rest of the cast that Queenzflip operates under different rules. Then Flip reveals something interesting. He says that Ian did indeed tell him he was going to get paid while he was suspended, which to me reveals that Flip just doesn't listen. He doesn't listen, and he's a little bit crazy. Sometimes he just is clouded judgment. Either he didn't listen or pretended like he didn't hear Ian so he could double up on the money he would make while he was suspended. That's a possibility. I don't put it above Flip. Then Imani calls out Flip for his actions, and what Flip said was that nobody defended him, and Imani calls him out for that, and Flip says it's every man for himself and nobody held him down. And I think Imani was noting, hey man, would you have held us down if Joe Budden got into an argument with us? And everybody knows that's not the case. And then Imani highlights and says that Flip picks and chooses when to be mature. Like 1 minute he'll be super mature, but then when it's beneficial to his setup, he'll start acting immature, start flipping the house, start trying to flip Joe's network. Then Flip wants to move on and says he doesn't want to make it about himself. And Ish rightfully corrects Flip and says Flip loves making it about himself all the time. This is true. Flip is notorious for not listening to people when they are speaking. Basically, Flip hears what he wants to hear, whatever is advantageous to make his point. After that, Flip notes that Corey called Joe and Flip emotional when they were going back and forth. I guess this was his way of diffusing the situation. Then apparently Vern, Vern, he's the ominous figure of the Joe Budden universe. He's Joe Budden's friend. Apparently he's ill with the hands like 92 Roy Jones, and he was in the background saying that it was best for Flip and Joe to get this out. And well, I guess Vern is in the background now more often. Could we be seeing Vern as a mic on the podcast? Who knows? I don't even know if he can speak. For all I know, he probably just never talks and just punches people. Then Flip says Ish told Joe and Flip that fighting is corny. This is all what's happening during the argument. Now, you might be saying, like, Danny, how do you know this happened? Well, it turns out that Flip recorded the argument for his own personal use. Like, right, he wanted a documentation of what went down. So then Ish says, hey man, why did you record that exchange? And Flip responds saying he needed proof of what Joe says to him because often Joe doesn't remember how mean he is or whatever Flip's intention was. And Flip claims that he isn't recording with any intent, but that's simply not true, as he just revealed his intent by saying that he wanted to capture what Joe says so he can replay it back to him and highlight what Joe said. So Flip, you gotta be a better manipulator. I think you're just used to being around people who don't have any smarts. Then Flip says he would never use a breakup or fallout as a rollout. I'm starting to think Flip is projecting here, and he would indeed use a breakup or fallout as something to boost his network. I mean, why does he say it so much? It's like he constantly thinks about it, so eventually he's gonna manifest it if he's not careful. After that, Flip once again outlines how he went to Joe's house to speak to him, and Joe acted like he wasn't home. Now, was Joe actually not in the house, or did he stay in the house like a battered housewife afraid of confronting her violent ex? I don't know. It seems odd if you ask me. Imani then says Flip and Joe have A-Mike syndrome, and it will cause them to be at odds very often. Imani then says Flip has a hard time taking orders because he is usually the one in control. Yeah, this is pretty true. Spot on by Imani. I think Flip has some type of mental disorder or something where he just can't take orders, right? If you tell Flip what to do, he will seek to do the opposite. So with a guy like Flip, it's often better to tell him to do the exact opposite so he can do exactly what you want him to do. The guy's like a big tub of water. You just gotta hope it doesn't spill over, because he's not gonna be able to control himself unless he's in the control seat. Imani then correctly notes that Joe isn't the most tactful, with Parks reinforcing Imani and highlighting how Joe enjoys throwing salt into the wound whenever he's arguing with somebody. Now, this is interesting because this is an exact callback to what Parks said about Joe during the Rory and Mal split. Remember when there was the split between Rory, Mal, and Joe, and there was this initial argument? On the Tea Leaves episode, Parks says this exact thing. Hey, you was arguing with Mal, you saw a wound, and you threw salt in it in order to hurt Mal. I have no doubt that he's talking about the comment Joe made when he said this show is none of your business. Then M4 is conspicuously quiet, twiddling her thumbs. I find that interesting. Why is M4 so quiet as Flip is recounting the story of how he got suspended? Because it is mentioned in this back and forth that Flip and Melissa Ford were arguing themselves. So I truly believe Queenzflip crossed the line when debating with Melissa Ford. I think it was that sexual assault thing that he brought up. Remember, you held it down, and that angered Melissa Ford, or something he did. It's just wild, and Melissa Ford is not saying her issues with Flip. Then Flip highlights how his skits and content did well while he was suspended for the show, and after that, Flip reveals some off-air info about Melissa Ford calling her boyfriend, and M4 and Ish kind of look at Flip as weird for doing that. So it's funny that during this whole breakdown of how he got suspended, Flip does something again that might get him suspended, which is talking about things that happen off air on air. Now, this was a fascinating breakdown. I think it reveals further insight into how oblivious Flip is to his way of being. I think he needs to look back at this episode, look back at the first few minutes, and see how everyone's reacting to him. The reason nobody was on your side is because nobody agrees with what you're doing. If people actually thought you were in the right, they would at least take up for you a little bit. They would at least say, well, maybe, Joe was bugging out, but nobody did because you're absolutely crazy. You're a nutcase. Yes, Joe flew off the handle, and he still hasn't very much grown from his fallout with Rory and Mal if you analyze this situation, but I'll do a video about that later. But Flip, he's just hard to deal with, and he thinks that he's the best thing in the business, so that justifies his actions. But let me know what you think. This is all something that happened on the Patreon. If you feel like it happened different, let me know in the comments. It was just a breakdown of how Flip got suspended, and it was on the Patreon episode that happened today. Alright, y'all, I just want to remind you to subscribe to my Patreon, follow me on Instagram, follow me on Twitter to Stop TV. I'll leave my Patreon linked in the top comment. Besides that, have a wonderful day. Don't be fooled by the blogs that I got. I'm still Danny from the Stop. Salute!